Hello, and welcome again to our looking to the coming week, which is the fourth weekend of Advent. And the readings, I'll start with that just so we get those in place. The first reading comes from the second book of Samuel from chapter 7. And there are a number of verses, not all used together, so they're selective. But we'll talk a little bit about that maybe later. The second reading is from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verses 25 to 29. And the gospel comes from the tradition according to Luke, chapter 1, verses 26 to 38. Now, a little bit of a background for how this fourth Sunday of Advent, or fourth weekend of Advent, is looked at. If there is a common theme that runs through the 3 years, remember we have A, B, and C, we're in the B year here, it is that it has something to do with the lineage of Jesus and the fact that that lineage is connected with David. It's very important for the two writers who present stories about the birth of Jesus. And remember, there are only two of the four gospel writers that have stories, namely Matthew and Luke. And of those two, or when you look at those two, the material they include concerning the conception, birth, and early days of Jesus are very different. In fact, Matthew and Luke agree on only a couple of points, and one of them, of course, is the Davidic line of Jesus. How that line fleshes out is taken a little differently in the Gospel according to Matthew. It comes through the lineage of Joseph. In the Gospel of Luke, it comes through the lineage of Mary. But either way you put it together, you have this Davidic liturgy lineup. Now, there's a lot of things that could be said here. In this year, the first gospel reading comes from Luke, which is one of two stories that are connected before the birth of Jesus. Namely, today we will see the visitation of an angel who announces to Mary that she is to be the mother of God. And next year in C will be the visitation, where Mary visits a relative. And last year in A, the opening this Sunday told the story from Matthew's point of view. Now, I mention all of this just as a bit of background. Now, how to approach a little bit this story of Jesus as remembered in Luke. So we're looking at the Lucan tradition, and it basically provides reflections and stories for the Christmas season itself. And we will see a couple of those played out over the next couple of weeks. The Gospel of Luke presents the conception of Jesus and John. Now, what I want to say here is, in this gospel, there is a great concern on the part of the gospel writer with regard to John's role and John's position. Probably, and I may have mentioned this before in other talks, but there remained a very strong commitment to John the Baptist, both at the time of Jesus and after the time of Jesus. You remember that John's ministry had begun well before Jesus did, and followers of John, who did think that he might be the Messiah, continued even after the time of Jesus. So one of the concerns that this gospel writer has is to recognize the importance of John, but also to, in a kind of nice way, put him in his place. And so the way in which he develops this is he develops what we call a diptych. Now, it's a technical term meaning two. And what he will do, he develops his story by giving 7 scenarios in the opening 2 chapters of his gospel. By the way, the material with regard to Jesus' early life is found in the opening 2 chapters of Luke and the opening 2 chapters of Matthew. But in Luke, he arranges it in such a way that these 7, let me give you a little bit the way in which it works, 7 episodes. Episode 1 will deal with the story of how John will be conceived. Episode 2 will tell the story of how Jesus is conceived. Episode 3 will picture Mary visiting a relative. Episode 4 will tell the birth and naming of John, and this will be matched by episode 5, in which the birth and naming of Jesus takes place. Then you will, again, coming together, a presentation story in verses 6 and that. And then finally, the end of the 2nd chapter in Luke will be what we call the finding of Jesus in the temple. Now, I give all of that as a little background for the structure of Luke's presentation of Jesus. What he does is he wants to, just so that it kind of suggests where I'm going here, he wants to point out that John is great before the Lord, but Jesus will be great and the Son of God. John will prepare a people. Jesus will rule the people. John's role is temporary. Jesus' kingdom will never end. John is to be a prophet, but Jesus, more than any other prophet, is also the Son of God. John will be filled with the Holy Spirit as a prophet. Mary will be overshadowed by the Spirit, and the power of the Most High will make Jesus the Holy One. So you can see that there's respect for John, but if you want to notice where he's going with this would be the gospel writer Luke, is that as important as John is, Jesus is better. And if you were a community of John believers, that is John the Baptist believers, well after the time of John and Jesus, you might blink your eyes a little bit and say, oh, that's why we should maybe turn to Jesus. Not that we were going to reject John, but that John's role was finished. Now, with that in mind, chapter 1 and chapter 2 present the story of the conception of the Baptist. Chapter 2, the conception of Jesus. Now, where we're going with this is that the gospel that we're looking at this weekend is what is known as the Annunciation story. The advantage to that is it's a well-known story, often used on feast days of Mary because of her saying yes, as we know at the end of this episode. But this is really a story about the conception of Jesus. So it is really about Jesus primarily, although certainly Mary plays a role. So how does this work? It works with a pattern which is found throughout the Old Testament in a number of places, known as an Annunciation pattern. And the Annunciation pattern has a certain way in which it works. Obviously, if it's a pattern, it has a certain way in which it works. So let me show you suggest what that is. There's the appearance, usually of a divine figure. This is followed by the fact that there is fear and confusion on the part of the person who is receiving this visitation, if you want. Then the guest, the divine person, announces what his purpose is or what the message is going to be. This is followed by an objection on the part of the person getting the message. It will be different depending on who the person is. And then it will conclude with a final saying, well, okay, that's the way it's going to be. Sometimes the person receiving this message asks for a sign, and generally it's given. All right, that's the pattern. Now let's watch how that works. In chapter 1, there is a priest named Zachary or Zechariah who is doing his duty in the temple when suddenly he is visited by an angel. Now this angel is designated as a figure who appears in the book of Daniel, namely an angel named Gabriel. Now, I don't know what your thought about angels are, but rather than thinking of a figure who pops in with wings that can kind of float by, think of this person as a person. How they identify the person as an angel? Well, what is an angel? A messenger. What kind of messenger is this? A messenger of the divine. How that person receiving this message figures that out? Well, remember, it's the gospel writer now who can kind of tells this story, and we use our imagination. But when you think of Gabe, don't think of him really as floating in. Suddenly he appears. He appears to Zachary in the temple. Zachary, a priest, is doing his job. He has been assigned to offer the appropriate sacrifice, the evening sacrifice for the people. And Zachary is kind of surprised because the angel says to him, well, now don't be afraid, but you are going to be a father. Well, really? Because Zach says, yeah, but you know, I'm a little bit older, my wife and I, beyond the usual time of conception. Now, sometimes we picture Zachary as ready to crawl out of this life, like he's 80 or 90. All it's just saying is that he and Elizabeth are beyond the stage of usually having children, or maybe they have tried to not have children. But you will be the father of a son. Now, even that might surprise us, because today, if you want to know what your offspring is going to be before she or he is born, you can do a little test and see it's going to be a boy or a girl. In those days, you did not know what the offspring was going to be. So even the news that it's going to be a son is interesting, see? So there are a lot of dynamics that go on in this particular story. This, the angel Gabriel, as I said, appears in the book of Daniel. He also seems to appear in other places. He is really the special messenger of God. Zach, when he kind of finds it very difficult to accept this message from the angel, then is given a sign. And the sign that Zachary will receive is, from now until the birth of the child, you will not be able to speak. So he is struck dumb. This becomes a sign. Now, whether or not for the next 9 months, Elizabeth found this to be something nice that her husband couldn't complain, we don't know. But anyway, that is the sign, and the angel disappears or leaves. Now come to the message of this week. Mary suddenly is visited by the same angel, by the same Gabriel. Keep in mind what is said about what he might appear. And says to Mary, don't be afraid. And okay, you can see that she is perplexed, as was Zachary perplexed. You are to be the mother of the Messiah. That's the announcement. Mary then says, well, that sounds good, but you know that I am a betrothed, that I am still a virgin, and that I have not known any relationships. How then can this be? Well, Gabriel says, then the power of the Holy Spirit will overshadow you, and the one who will be born will be called Son of God, the Holy One. That is the sign. Now, what's Mary's sign? Where Zachary had kind of questioned the angel and got a little bit of a zap, Mary just kind of states a fact, and she comes off okay. Her final response is, well, then let it be done according to your will. And so those are, notice there's a parallel between what happens with Zachary and what happens with Mary when she is visited by the angel. What is the commonality is that Zachary and Elizabeth are of the Davidic line. Mary is also of the Davidic line. Or another way to look at the idea of that is of the house of David. And that will be the reason for the first reading being chosen this time, which tells about God's making a promise with David to let his house continue. All right. Now, when we look at this, I think, keep in mind that it is what we would call our Christological understanding here. That is our understanding of Jesus that really colors the way in which we understand this story. Luke is presenting this story in a, as I mentioned, traditional pattern. This pattern of annunciation, of people's response and interaction with the divine messenger, would have been familiar to others who were reading or living with the Old Testament. Messages like this had come to Samuel's mom and to others. You can look through the Old Testament to see illustrations of this. Perhaps the most interesting would be to Abraham, where he is told on 2 different occasions that he's going to have a son. One turns out to be Ishmael, the other turns out to be Isaac. So in the tradition, there's a pattern. And also we believe that Luke's audience, we're always kind of concerned who the gospel writers were hoping would be listening to and reading their work, tended, we believe, to be what we would call a Gentile Christian community. Now, obviously the author is very familiar with Judaism also, but primarily he is writing his work for a non-Jewish community, and sometimes, therefore, he has to explain certain Jewish practices. So this picture, here are a couple of insights, and remember, not giving a homily here, but we're kind of trying to look at the biblical presentation, how what responses might happen to those who heard this story. A man appears to Mary. Now, where is Mary? Well, artists, of course, have had a field day with this. We see many artists traditionally of the Annunciation, the picture of Mary. Sometimes the angel has wings and stands a little bit back, sometimes not so close. Where would Mary be? Well, if Mary is betrothed to Joseph, she would have been in her home. Now, the tradition says that that home was in Nazareth. And Luke, of course, makes Nazareth not only as the place where Mary and Joseph seem to come from, but also where Jesus later on will grow up, and why the story of the trip to Bethlehem from Nazareth is part of his narration. So here's Mary. Now, where is she? Is she in the house? Is she in the garden? And suddenly a man appears. Now, how does that look? I mean, what's he doing there? How did he get in? Now, we might smile at that, but think about that. And what's at stake here, which is something that we've mentioned often, a value that was very much supported by all the cultures of the Mediterranean, namely honor. If this man appears with Mary, is she alone? It doesn't seem to be anybody else around. Isn't this a kind of interesting scenario or situation? Well, as that may be, he then gives the message, and Mary says, but I am, now she could say, I am a virgin, and remember, an unmarried woman would be presumed to be a virgin, because if she were not, then when the marriage arrangements had been made and she was not, that would bring a certain dishonor to the family. Again, honor is at work here. You remember that marriages were generally arranged by families. The negotiator who kind of set the terms of the marriage would be the mother. The two mothers would meet and kind of make how things would work, and always to preserve the honor of the family, always to preserve the respect that was due to each. And then, of course, since this is a patriarchal world, the fathers would come in and give their approval, and it would look like they had made the deal. I mention all of this because of the four Gospels, in Luke's story, women tend to play a very interesting role. I'm not saying, we're careful here, that somehow Luke was a modern-day feminist. No, but he does put women in very important places. Notice the contrast between Zachary and Mary, and who comes out really respecting and being more careful, if not Mary. And there will be other incidences throughout this gospel in which women play a significant role. So from that point of view, we kind of look at what Luke has done in presenting the story of Jesus. So this intruder, and maybe not nice to say that about an angel, but think about it, he's not expected. I don't think they had coffee and tea ready for him when he came. And he gives the message, and as I say, she kind of says to him just exactly how this is going to take place. And then the angel gives the words that we are quite familiar with. The holy power of the Most High shall overshadow you. Most High, of course, is God, is going to be responsible for the conception of the child, namely Jesus. And he will have important titles: Son of God, the Holy One. Mary then says, and I always have to be a little careful here because there's a very rich tradition which pictures Mary as saying, yes, behold the handmaiden of the Lord, be it done to me according to your word. Now, someone has pointed out that once this message is given to Mary, what can she say? Well, all right, I get it. I'll do just as you want. Now, that maybe doesn't sound pious enough. And in fact, as someone has pointed out, when the angel leaves, Mary is as perplexed about this whole thing as she was before the angel came. I mean, he says you're going to be a mother. She doesn't know how. What does the power of the Most High mean? So there's a lot of, if one put it somewhat on a historical basis, a lot of details here that are not answered. But what is important is, of course, the establishment that this child is to be the Messiah, is to be the Holy One. And honor is preserved. Now, we may not be all that concerned about honor in our day, although I think certainly we are. But as I've noticed, and we've noticed, it was extremely important in the old days. Now, this, and maybe just a thought there, turns out to be an unsettling experience for Mary. She was not After all, her future will be different. You can almost get the invisible questions, which are not part of the gospel itself, but how would Mary explain this to her parents, to her betrothed Joseph, to her neighbors, so that there is, Luke sees it's a wonderful intervention on the part of God, bringing something new into the story of humankind, but it does place some of the characters or persons who are responsible for this in difficult and trying times. But there is the annunciation, namely of the power of God coming to work through the agreement of Mary. Certainly one cannot set that aside, that if she did not say, well, whatever you want, I'll do, the child would not have been conceived. And so in that sense, Mary is much more open to God than Zachary, although Zachary, I think, just is surprised that this could happen. And his confusion also, I think, would be typical if you put yourself in his position and see what your response might have been. The message here is that the wondrous birth of Jesus will exceed those of any other birth. Other famous people had been announced, but this one is quite unique. Now, a quick word, and as I say, there's much more to learn about the whole structure of Luke's presentation here. Maybe we'll have some mention of this next time when we see another episode from Luke's Gospel. The book of Samuel, 2 Samuel, presents what is known here as the dynastic oracle. Namely, it involves the fact that David, who was the king by this time, quite successful, had decided that it would be appropriate for him, because now he had a capital city and he had built himself a rather nice palace, it would be appropriate for him to also build a house for God. And he tells his prophet, his spokesperson Nathan, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to have a temple built. And Nathan, well, as the boss says, you're going to have a temple, says that's a good idea, I guess. Okay. Except that night, God speaks to Nathan and says, look, go and tell my servant David, sometimes he thinks he's in charge here, but always remember that I am in charge. And he gives a long explanation. For years, I never needed a place to be present. I was with the Israelites as they wandered through the wilderness. I was in the temple, the meeting temple, and present there. I was at the various shrines that were erected when we came into the Holy Land. Thank you, David, but I do not need a house. I'm pretty, and in fact, Dave, don't try to fence me in. I like to be free. And there's a whole kind of theology here that's at work. Well, that could end, but then God says to David, but I will do something for you. I will create a house for you. Now here, of course, the word house is lineage. Or it is also known as the Davidic covenant. There are a number of covenants. The most famous and important is the Sinai covenant that God made with Moses and ultimately with Israel. But this is a covenant made now with David, which in a certain way would exist for a while, and David's son Solomon would take over, and there would be some others, but at a certain point, the physicalness of the kingship line of David came to an end. But now it will continue on in this new covenant that will be part of your lineage. And here, therefore, is why this story is remembered. Who will carry on the tradition of David, but this promised Messiah, this promise to Christ that God has created and thus fulfills the promise that he made to David that your covenant, my covenant rather, with you will never end. So there is this fidelity and this loyalty here. And finally, the little reminder that Nathan says to David, and by the way, you're not the boss, you are the servant of the Lord. And of course, there you can see Mary's response, similar, behold the handmaid of the Lord. And so this is a nice reading here on this fourth Sunday of Advent. Well, wishes for a Merry Christmas, because we will not be really doing an analysis of the Christmas story, and next week we'll kind of move on in Luke's story to see something else. Once again, thank you for being with us, and have a good day.